Hello, Brett here from Dev Game Club. As I mentioned last week, we are working through some end of summer scheduling challenges and are pleased to present to you some audio from our Discord channel. If that's of interest to you, you might enjoy the Discord community itself, and there will be a link in the show notes. We offer our thanks to this week's hosts, Mark Garcia, Calamity Nolan, Lost Lake, and Ultrason. If not, skip along, and we will see you next week with more Heroes of Might and Magic. Take care.
Bretton, Bretton, Tim, Bretton and Bretton, Tim, Bretton, Bretton, Tim. This is not them. Welcome, everyone. This is a little atypical for the cast, but we like to call this the DGC Squared cast. That is the Dev Game Club Discord Game Club cast. I am Ohai Mark, joined here by my co-host. I'll start with Calamity Nolan. Welcome, Calamity.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Lost Lake.
Hi, thanks for having me as well.
And then Ultrasun.
Hello, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so we're all jumping on because we were partaking in a community game club that we had a few months back regarding Final Fantasy 15. And so I guess I wanted to just kind of kick off the cast this week with everybody kind of talking about their history with this game, if any, and kind of where they came in when the game club itself started. We'll go ahead and I'm going to kick it to Calamity first because he had kind of an interesting experience with it.
Sure. So I am a big Final Fantasy fan and have played all of them up until 13.3, but never actually jumped into 15 for a couple of reasons. I bought it a while ago, but never got around to playing it. And then when we were doing the game club, I did not have time to do a full game, so I did the Pocket Edition instead.
Awesome. Really kind of interested to hear some of your perspectives and takes as we move through the episode today. But thanks for that, and I'll pass it over to Lost Lake.
I was also a longtime Final Fantasy player. Started really on the Super Nintendo with 6. Did a lot on the PlayStation with like 7, 8, 9. I had stopped playing with 10. 10 kind of threw me off. So I was absent during 11, 12, 13, 14. But then 15 came out, and it had been a while since we'd had a mainline Final Fantasy. I was sold by the trailers, so I jumped in day one. I had my copy, and I even have an art book here from that day. So then I didn't touch it again until Belmont suggested we pick it up for this. So it was kind of fun to go back to my old 100% save and just get to play it all over again at a much faster pace.
That's awesome. I definitely was a bit envious because it seemed like you and Belmont were not speaking in code, but pretty close to that since y'all both had prior experience with it. And so as we were playing through, I was like, man, I got to catch up so I can understand what the heck these guys are talking about here. But it made it kind of fun to kind of follow along. So thanks for that. Ultrason, why don't you give us a bit of your background with it?
Yeah, and as for me, actually, this was more or less the first Final Fantasy I played. I played like a bit of the first Final Fantasy on iOS. There was some port, and then that's about it. And then 15 came out. A friend heavily recommended it to me, and I played, I don't know, maybe 4 hours of it, and then kind of gave up because the combat was really strange. And then for the cast, I played an additional 25 hours. So yeah, It's actually really fun. You do have to get used to the combat, I think, though. But yeah. I have bought other Final Fantasies, but never played them. I have Final Fantasy X on the PS3, just waiting to be played. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, glad to hear that. Like, it sounds like we're kind of all coming from various backgrounds with it, and I'm glad to hear that you like dove back in and got those 25 hours in. I myself started my Final Fantasy journey on the PlayStation 1 with Final Fantasy VII. Before that, it was actually the second JRPG that I had played. I played Super Mario RPG on the SNES before that, but not Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger. After 7, I was immediately hooked, so bought and played Final Fantasy 8 to completion, Final Fantasy 9 to completion. Really funny side story about Final Fantasy X, which is one of my favorites, that I had gotten in college, but it basically was outlawed in my fraternity house at the time because my roommate got tired of people coming in and starting and playing to the same 10-hour mark. And it was like 30 people who did that. But after 10, I did play 12 while I was in graduate school. Picked up 11 and played it for a hot second before bouncing off of it and getting hooked on World of Warcraft. And then played the first maybe 7 hours of Final Fantasy 13 before bouncing off of it pretty hard. I had played or started playing Final Fantasy 16. I'm apparently like 23 hours into that game right now. And then when Belmont suggested this, I was like, oh, okay, I'll go ahead and give it a try, because I remember I had picked it up briefly and played about an hour of it at one point in time. And kind of the same way you felt, Elcherson, like the combat just didn't resonate with me, and the tutorials were very, very obtuse. And so I wound up feeling like it was just too much. So I was very happy to have Belmont and Lost Lake pop in and say, hey, ignore the tutorials on the battle system and just kind of go with the flow of the game. Because it wound up being a very enjoyable experience. So yeah, that's kind of my history with it as well. So I guess I wanted to jump into some of the discussion topics that we had kind of built out here. The first that I really wanted to kind of just start with before we dive into the more granular pieces were, like, how did everybody kind of feel about the game as a whole? Calamity, I know you were on Pocket Edition, so you might, your mileage may vary compared to the rest of us, but I was just kind of curious how people felt. Like, was it overall like a good experience, like a mid experience, or like a meh, whatever kind of experience?
Sure, for me, it was pretty mid. It's definitely not my favorite Final Fantasy, and I don't think it's in the contention for best Final Fantasy. I think if you say, like, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 is your favorite, then that's, like, the correct answer, and anything else should be met with skepticism. But, yeah, I don't know. It was okay. There were some parts I liked a lot more than I thought I would, and there were some parts that I liked a lot less than I thought I would. It's kind of an uneven experience, and, famously has a complicated production schedule, so it didn't quite feel like a complete game to me.
Yeah, I would really agree with that. Even playing the full console version and not the Pocket Edition, you could kind of feel, in a similar way, I think, to like Xenogears, how the production, like the scope creep crept in, and eventually they got to a point where they were just told, you have to finish this. Lost Lake or Ultrason, feel free to jump in. Your experiences with it?
Yeah, I think I can echo what Calamity said. Though I've not played the other games, it reminded me a little bit like Metal Gear Solid 5. A lot of ambition, a lot of big ideas, and then sometime on the execution, it just felt like they had to stop before they got to where they wanted to. Like, the world is huge, but then it's like really hard to get anywhere. Like, it takes forever to move from one place to another, for example. So I feel like that's a good example of how they were like, we're going to make an open world, it's going to be huge, and then there's not that many good ways of traversing it. And the combat is another example. I feel like it's very deep, but to get to the depth of it, you have to get past an initial shock of how clumsy it is at first. So, yeah.
The first time I got around to this one, I was thirsty for a big JRPG. I was looking forward to this. I knew about the troubled, release cycle on this. I watched the trailers for 10 years of it being Final Fantasy 13 2 and slowly being moved into Final Fantasy 15. And then we got told during a trailer that it was Final Fantasy 15. Then we get to release date. Well, just before release date. And here I am excited for my wonderful game, and I find out I have to watch a movie to know what's going on in the game. But don't watch the movie before you start the game, because you should really get like a chapter or so in first, then watch the movie. And it was quite the release. I really enjoyed running around the world doing the missions, the side quests and whatnot. And then I would feel very disappointed at the end of it, because at that point there was no DLC. So the ending I got is kind of the ending I got. And yeah, that's probably why I put it down and I didn't go back, was no matter what they added with the DLC stuff, it wasn't enough to catch my attention until Belmont turned around and said, let's take a look at it.
Y'all all raised some really interesting points that I do want to come back to on this. From the size of the world and Calamity, I definitely am going to want some of your takes on the Pocket Edition, because I've played a little bit of it, but not a whole lot, so I don't know how that's going to reflect there. And then Lost Lake, to your points, like some of the story aspects, like Final Fantasies can get fairly convoluted stories, but this one I think takes the cake in that perspective. So I completely understand like any feelings you may have with regards to the story feeling like either incomplete or I dedicated all this time and got that. My overall experience, I would say, with the game was favorable at the end of all of it, but that was only after I went following the credit roll and did about 3 or 4 hours of additional research to find out what the heck was going on through some of the other aspects of the story that were a little more convoluted. And once I got there and realized, oh, yeah, if I had had the time to dedicate to some of the DLC content and branch out in these side stories, if I had access to these animated series, if I had access to these printed copies of books, and if I didn't have kids and could just literally submerge myself in everything Final Fantasy 15 for the next 2 weeks, this is actually a really compelling world and story. And all of it together, like the sum of all of those pieces, is very, very intriguing to me. But I don't feel like it was strongly enough reflected in the initial release of this game. To your point, though, like one thing I do distinctly remember about the hype train for this game was the playable demo that was released months before it came out, where I think Jason Schreier had an article on Kotaku about it, and it seemed like everybody was just completely and totally jazzed about Final Fantasy again.
I bought a game for that demo, and the game was horrible. I brought the game back to EB Games afterwards after I got the demo out of it.
Can you remind me what game it was?
It's like Final Fantasy 0?
Oh, was it Type O? It was Final Fantasy
Type O.
That's right.
I did that too, but I actually kind of like
Same.
Type O. Type 0, whatever it is, yeah.
I was not in the mood for the high school setup Final Fantasy at that very moment. I wanted Final Fantasy 15.
Different teenagers.
I did the exact same thing. bought the typo. I still have. I think I don't have the. No, I do have my Final Fantasy typo box floating around here somewhere still, just so that I could play that demo. Anyway, okay, so it sounds like we're all kind of coming. I would assume, like, from the general vibe I'm getting, like from Calamity's mid-range to maybe moderately warm, or let's call it tepid, on the game itself as a whole. I don't think anybody is like just it's smoldering, except maybe Belmont, who unfortunately was unable to join us right now. I do want to go, though, into some of the topics y'all brought up, because Calamity, I'm really, really, like I said, fascinated to hear about the Pocket Edition. I think one of the first things that I noticed about this game, booting it up the very first time, as well as my continued playthrough this time, was just the general size and scope of the world. Like, there was this really, really gigantic space to move around in pretty early on, which was pretty remarkable for a Final Fantasy game. Because the vast majority of them up to this point were very, very linear, and even if they did have more open spaces like Final Fantasy XII attempted to do, they were more kind of compartmentalized spaces that had gates that you would move through to get to the next space. So it wasn't one continuous space you could just explore from start to finish. How did y'all feel about the size of the world, the scale, and Calamity? Were there limitations, because I feel like there probably were, in the Pocket Edition that maybe would have removed some of that awe and wonder that somebody might have felt picking up this game for the first time on the console?
Sure, I can start. I'm actually pretty positive on the Pocket Edition. I watched Lost Lake playing through some of the game and the DLC and some of the side quests that were not present, and so that's my comparison point. But I think that they did a really great job. Real quick, to set up what the Pocket Edition is, they did this wild thing where after releasing, their full high-fidelity, big open-world Final Fantasy game, they also did a demake at the same time, where they have, like, these low-poly models and a pared-down story, and they cut out a bunch of the side missions, and they redo the maps so that they're more these small self-contained rooms, and released that at almost the exact same time. So it would, come out on the next-gen consoles or current-gen consoles at that time in the full release, and then on things like Switch and, mobile phones came out in Pocket Edition. So I played the demake version, and I think they did a great job. I'm not really into open world games, and so cutting out a lot of those big empty spaces that I saw Lost Lake driving around in was just fine with me. The cutscenes had the exact same audio and a lot of the same animations, and I think that it actually looked a lot better with these, like, stylized chibi versions in some cases than the, like, kind of glassy-eyed high-fidelity versions that they had. And some of the camera angles, I think, were better in the Pocket Edition. Some of the, like, staging worked a lot better for me. Yeah, I don't know. And then, obviously, the one thing that I kind of missed was the side quests, because those are my, something I quite enjoy in JRPGs, and those were gone. But the rest of it, I thought they did a great job, and it was pretty true to the experience.
Well, that's awesome to hear. I do remember, I think I played through maybe the end of Chapter 1, or maybe it was the first, whatever. I know when they released the Pocket Edition on, I think, iOS, you could get the first maybe chapter free or something like that. And so I do recall playing through that at, one of those, I think, Discount Tires, getting my tires changed. And it feeling pretty solid at the time. So I'm glad to hear at least that they kind of captured that. And I do agree with you that there is something quite charming about the chibi kind of variants that they chose to use that makes it almost feel a little more approachable than the full console release. Lost Lake, Ultrason, how are y'all feeling about the size and scope of that, especially those first, like over the first half or I guess 2/3 of the game?
See, the scope I thought was impressive, especially given the history of Final Fantasy with 1332 coming out right before that, and everyone complaining how linear those were, and then having 15 go and kind of go the opposite direction entirely and just be like, here's this giant world. So I thought the scope was impressive. It was really big. And just the opening of the game, when they're pushing the car, you look all around you and it's all just horizon, and you can see things far off in the distance, and everything's in it is a little bit the Breath of the Wild thing of if you can see it, you can get there. Most of the time, that is true in this game. So the scope itself is great, and then the execution of it sometimes is what bogs it down. While this world is huge, you can't climb, and that, for example, gets really annoying, because then you're like, oh, there's this cliff here. I have to go on top of this cliff, but there's only one angle at which I can have a ramp that gets me onto that cliff. So you just circle just a big cliff until you find the one ramp, and then you can go up it, and then you can get to the objective. That's what I think is most infuriating about it. But then other times, when you're fighting giant monsters in this giant field, and then little monsters are coming from a different part of the map and just joining this fight, it kind of comes together and it's great. Or when you're driving around and you see all these vistas around you, or the crater, that's like the center of the first couple chapters. That's when it really like sells it. And then I didn't get further than chapter 6, so I don't know what they do with that after that. But I do hope they pay it off more than that. But even at the first couple chapters, it is like they do make it worth it. But yeah, I'm impressed. I'm interested to see what Leslie has to say about it.
I was one of the ones who stopped playing Final Fantasy because I felt railroaded. That's why I stopped with 10, and that's why I never got into 13. So, as an old Final Fantasy person who wanted the big open world right off the bat, it felt wonderful. I think it looks pretty. I definitely appreciated it a lot more my first time, when I had to run around and do some of the side hunts and fishing, and I had a lot more time to take in the world on those. And on this second playthrough in the New Game Plus, I actually really like that I didn't have to interact with any of the side stuff. It looked pretty, but it was kind of nice that I didn't have to run for 15, 20 minutes to get to a hunt spot to do a 5-minute battle, to run for another 5, 10, 15 minutes to, like, my New Game Plus, I did a lot of fast travel back to the car, move here, fast travel back to the car. Like, I used that as much as I could. It was a wonderful world. I remember being captivated the first time, and thinking it's beautiful the second time. But I think my favorite part of looking across the map is the landmarking, is being able to see what's coming up and where you were going, especially on some of those long drives where you were listening to the music and looking forward to your next mission. You could kind of peek and be like, oh, okay, that's the building that I'm going to go infiltrate. Kind of get an idea as you're driving up with the guys But in this day and age, I would not have had the time to go do all the hunts and everything and all the fishing, and I really wouldn't have experienced that much of the world. I would have pretty much stayed on track.
I'm right there with you. For me, if I didn't have the Steam Deck, I would not have been able to participate in this game club. The amount of time needed to actually dedicate to that first 2/3 of the game was just so insane that I just, I would not have been able to sit down and do it. I definitely agree with y'all. The size of the world, it really does kind of actually surprise me that this was, and I forget too that Metal Gear Solid 5 was the same generation as this game, but it just still kind of like took me by surprise how large that world was if you wanted to just go out on foot and explore it, or go out on Chocobo and explore it. Ultrason, to your point, there were moments where I would see something and I'd be like, this is really cool, I want to go explore it, and then I would have gone to the wrong side of whatever it was and have to backtrack for 20 minutes to find out where the heck I could go to get up on the structure I was interested in, which was further made infuriating by the fact that at various points in time during battle, I would throw my sword into a cliff face that was clearly up around that area, and I'm like, well, why couldn't I just fast travel up that way? But all of that said, I love the diversity in the environments and the fact that they all were part of this singular space. And that you kind of could just go where you wanted to at various points in time. Obviously, there were roadblocks to keep you kind of gated initially until you let the whole thing kind of expand. But I really dug just kind of like the wonder of being able to explore the world map proper and go and do these things. So for the most part, I did dig the side missions. I do agree, Lost Lake, that there gets to be a point in time where you're kind of like, okay, this is really like, they had some check marks and check boxes that they knew this is what we wanted to do. Let's go ahead and make a bunch of missions. And so there starts to get kind of a sameness feeling to a lot of them. But I feel like if you're really enjoying the game, then that's totally fine. And then once you get to the end and you kind of realize what the story is, there's also, to a degree, you could argue like a justification if you are role-playing, Noctis, as to why he might not care that he's doing these samey things so long when he's gallivanting around with his best friends. So, yeah. Go ahead, Clement.
I was going to say, it's interesting, I think, the comparison to Final Fantasy 13, which is a game I quite like, and I think Final Fantasy 13-2 has the best battle system in the entire Final Fantasy series, but it's kind of the inverse of 15, right? Because 15 starts off and it's very open, and then you get railroaded for the second half of the game, and it's all just, corridors after that. Whereas 13 is corridors for the first half, and then it's open after that.
Yep.
So I think maybe they learned that people are only going to play 25 hours, and to front load that.
Yeah, I think... And that might be one of those things where, hey, if they play that first 25 hours in an open world Final Fantasy, maybe that brings them back to the next one. I don't know.
Right.
I will say, I do love that about this series, that it does take those risks and feel comfortable in experimenting to see if there's something new that they haven't considered that they could make work for it. Sorry, somebody was trying to talk and I interrupted you.
Oh, one thing I was going to say that while you were talking, I was thinking, the warp points. That's one thing that frustrated me for the exploration, is you can warp point during combat, and like you said, it'll take you to a cliff, and you're like, why can't I go there? And I feel like the exploration would have been really interesting if they just integrated the warp points that they spawn during combat, and you could just go from place to place using that. Because it seems like a missed opportunity to just let you warp around the map, because they kind of let you do that anyway. And that's one thing that I feel like that might have been the little thing that would have made the exploration more fun for me. Without it being full Breath of the Wild, you can climb everywhere.
I'm actually wondering if that was a part of the initial plan, because when we think back to the trailer where Noctis is like running through a crazy hallway, he uses his sword to warp point through a window, I believe. So it looks like when this was maybe a little bit more action oriented, or the previous thought, it does look like they wanted to use that warp point thing a little bit more.
And you look at maybe Kingdom Hearts 3, right, which is made by same lead, and that has such a like dynamic flow combat system to get around, and maybe they were trying to do something more with that, where you had all these like points that would connect up to each other, and you can like use it for exploration or for fighting or for all sorts of things. So there's a more seamless back and forth.
Right. And speak of a Square game with a very convoluted story anyway.
I don't think this story is that convoluted. I thought it was pretty simple, actually. I could, like, see the outline, and I think that they just did a bad job of writing in the details.
Of, like, connecting the dots?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I think it's a pretty simple story, actually.
Yeah, I think the latter parts of it I definitely got and picked up on. I think it was the initial pieces where I was trying to kind of say, okay, what the heck's happening here? It may have also been just the amount of time that we took from start to finish for me to really fully grasp it. I think if I had a week where I was able to just play through the game proper and not get interruptions and everything, it would have stayed fresher in my mind. And I do kind of wish it did something either like Final Fantasy 13 did, or like Final Fantasy 16 does, where you can at any point in time get like very quick refreshers, either during loading screens or through the active lore, whatever the thing is called in Final Fantasy 16, that basically just pops up with information and tells you who's who, what's going on, and why these people are critical to the story. Because I do feel there was just some moments where I had to step away for just a little bit too long, and I lost sight of what was going on in the story. But there again, I also have ADHD, so that does not play any way favorably with me maintaining my attention for long periods of time.
Right, something like the Witcher 3 recap when you load the game.
Yep.
Is always nice.
Yep.
That's one of the features I want in more games, because I'll come back to a game like 3 months later and be like, I don't know what's happening anymore.
Exactly. Yep. That's one of the main reasons I'll bounce off and not come back to a game. While we're talking about story, and we've talked kind of about scale and the world and everything, I think Belmont may have written in here, somebody wrote in here about the actual like cast. So, what are people's thoughts and how are y'all feeling on the main 4 characters? And then if we want to talk any ancillary characters as well, we can. Calamity, I know you had some hot takes during the actual game club in the channel and everything. So, but like Lost Lake and Ultrasun, if you had like favorite characters or interactions or anything like that, I'd be very interested to hear what you guys thought.
Sure, I can set it up a little bit. So, these are our main 4 characters, the boys. We have Prince Noctis, who's the main character, who, I don't know, is like a kind of brooding emo boy. We've got Gladiolus, who's the muscle guy and kind of, the tough with a heart of gold. We've got Ignis, who's the prissy one and does all the cooking, and then Prompto, who's the dumb one and also a photographer. So we got all of them. They talk at you a lot. I think part of the the dialogue is supposed to help reinforce what the story is, because when you're in a story mission, they'll tell you the same thing over and over again about what's going on in the moment. But it's it's really supposed to be about the interaction between these 4 characters, and they're best friends, I guess, and they go on a road trip, and they each have their own trials and tribulations and moments where they break away from the group and then ultimately come back because they're friends. And Noctis is there too. So, I don't know. I thought that it was another one of those things where the archetypes are very clear, but the actual moment to moment, I didn't really like them. They were underdeveloped, I would say. And then you have these big emotional scenes that didn't play for me at all, because I didn't really care about them.
I can completely understand that. I also feel like... Sorry, go ahead, Ultrason.
Alright. Yeah, I see what you mean about the archetypes are very clear, but then the characters aren't completely developed. I might disagree, because I do think that the characters... And I didn't finish the game, but I do think that like the characters did get a pretty good characterization from the get-go, and then as the story goes forward, they do seem to open up and give you a bit more information about them as it goes on. Some of it's a little heavy-handed, but I don't know that that's too shocking considering it's a JRPG. And I don't know, I felt like it was a very fun dynamic. I thought it was super well done. It's super inviting in a way. Like, you immediately feel for these characters. You immediately go, oh, okay, this is what they're about. This is what they're doing. And everything they do reinforces who they are. Like, Prompto is... I'm bad with names, I'm pretty sure. Prompto is the one with the dumb one, right? Like you said. And he would always... he's the one I always remember talking all the time. And I think that's on purpose. They very much want you to remember he's the one that wants you to know he's here all the time. He's the one that's loud. He's the one that just wants the attention. While Gladiolus, if that's how you say that, he says a couple lines, doesn't say as many lines at all. And Ignis always seems to be uppity. Just, he's up there, he's not concerned with what the others are thinking at all. The only one that's an exception to that rule is Noctis, but he might have just a bit too much of the main character syndrome. If that's what I'm thinking. It's just he doesn't say much, it is not too characterized, but that's because that's kind of on purpose. The only character he's really got is being a bit brooding, and I hope he opens up after the part I played too, but I don't know if that's the case, so please go on.
So my feeling about the story, about the characters, about the boys, is very much like the open world being funneled down into just the one line. I feel right off the bat, I love the boys. They get along, we're driving, we're out, we're doing hunts, they're chit-chatting, we're quipping, we're having fun along the way. And then there's events in the story that happen, and I don't get characters or emotions or any of it. It just didn't make sense to me. Especially the first time around, I didn't have a DLC to kind of explain where some of these other things happened and what was going on. And then, by the end of it, I feel like the characters only grew because something happened to them, not because they had to overcome, like, maybe the emotional things that they had to overcome were not just powerful enough for me to care. I think that's what it sticks down to. I don't believe they stuck the landing on any character for me in the end. Yeah.
I get where you're coming from, Lost. Like, I think what you're talking about is something. It's one of those things you see in television shows where they will go for like the quick gasp kind of reactionary scenario for an event to happen to a character that is supposed to then just immediately give sympathy instead of like the longer payoff of you actually seeing characters struggle with something and overcome that something. And I think that that's kind of what happens with the boys as well. I think that the vast majority of events in this game that happen almost abruptly. There's not enough time to really bond significantly with all of the characters. And I think that any bonding that really truly does have, at least for me personally, any bonding that really did happen between me and Noctis as a main character typically was me filling in the gaps that they had left out, just in an attempt to justify and make sense in my head of what his journey must really have been and what it must have meant. But there was no real true scene in the game that gave me that perspective and said, this is what's really happening and this is how he's dealing with it. Again, the development and everything of this, and it's very interesting to me too that there is the parallel driven of Metal Gear Solid 5 in this, because I feel both games have very rushed feeling stories, and the payoff you're supposed to feel at any point in time feels a bit contrived, because it again is just big moments. In Metal Gear, in that case, it is guess who this really is, or guess who this character is compared to the other version or the other stories in the Metal Gear universe you've played. And in this one, it's really here's just something shocking that maybe you weren't expecting, and it's happening, so just get used to it. But I will say this at the very least, the small talk and the banter, the one thing it did do for me was it did at least sell me on, even if I'm not buying any of those payoffs or anything, that these four guys are very close. And from a friendship perspective, I can at least understand and recognize then when Gladio comes and attempts to give Noctis advice, or Prompto does, or Ignis does. I at least feel okay, this at least reads reasonably well and normal to me because they are very good friends. Whereas I feel sometimes in cutscenes, you will get characters who seem at odds or supposed to be friends, and their interaction feels very, very foreign or alien, and it doesn't feel like two people who are friends would actually be engaging with one another. So I think they did stick the landing on establishing these four as a tight-knit, intimate group of friends. But then the big story points, for the most part, felt pretty flat for me. Or they were shocking, but they were not sad in the way I think that they wanted them to be sad for me.
Yeah, I think the voice performances were quite good, and I think that maybe carried a lot of the warmth and back and forth that was maybe not so present in the writing for me. And I think Lost absolutely nailed it when he said, things happen to these characters, but they don't change. I'm thinking, in particular, there's a moment, halfway through the game where something real bad happens to Ignis, and there's a little bit of a shift in the dynamic where Gladio is mad at Noct for some reason that's not really explained, but I think that, here's at least some tension in a conversation that people can, talk about, but then it just resolves itself, and then you're everyone's all good, and Ignis is also fine, kind of. And the only story beat that actually I think was effective was in the DLC for Ignis, when they kind of explained what happened after the fact to set that up. So it's weird that they couldn't... They were, I think, afraid of upending the status quo too much in the middle of it, right? Because they're well, we have to get to this story beat, but here's our moment where we can maybe make things a little bit different for a short time, and then it just, they throw it away when they need to move on to the next section.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say that typically for me is one of the biggest complaints I have about more recent Final Fantasy games as a whole in general, is just I feel like there are story points that are missed opportunities, and it's because there isn't as much growth from these characters as I would like. And I think you can look at a Western RPG too, and there's a great example I think is Mass Effect 2, where you have these individual missions for your partners that you can go on to build out and flesh out their stories, and those you do feel both closer to those partners, and you also do feel like there was growth made on their side of things. And I don't know that I always got that when I did the things in this game. And in a lot of the more recent Final Fantasies as a whole, I kind of feel that is one of the pieces that they still struggle with, is they try and build these really, really elaborate, rich, and to some degree sometimes huge, epic moments. But then the pieces in between that are supposed to thread it all together are not as well thought out and realized. Let's see. I wanted to talk just real quick. I don't want to spoil too much of the story for Ultrasun, because I really do feel like if you do choose to take it to completion, there are some really interesting things that can happen. But one thing I did want to bring to light here that I wanted to talk about and get everybody's take on, if you feel comfortable in talking about it, was, Lost, you had mentioned the side quest earlier, and I wanted to come back to that, because when I got to the end of this game, I actually felt, on the whole, that it's one of the few games I've played that actually justifies side quests in a game. Like, when you have this, seemingly really critical task you're trying to take to completion, and all of a sudden the main character is like, nah, I want to go over here and do this thing. In most games like Fallout, especially like Fallout 4, I've got to find my son, but I want to go do all these other things. Or, Dead Rising, or Dead Rising 2 especially. Let's go do all these side missions instead of this critical thing for this person I care about. This one, I really felt there was a justification for it when you got to the conclusion. And I was like, this is why Noctis wants to keep doing these things that might just seem trivial, because it means he gets to be with these three people longer to do those things, and he gets to kind of spend that time with them. And so I felt at the very least that by the time I got to the end of it, I was like, I realize now why the first 2/3 of this game were open world and letting me go do whatever I wanted to, and then the final bits of it were just, let's race you to the end. At least to me that felt cohesive, but I'd be interested on y'all's thoughts on that.
Well, that and, there are 3 or 4 sets of different MacGuffins that he has to track down. So they're like, oh, well, you gotta get all these things, and also all of these things, and maybe go find that, but, that's somewhere else. I don't know. It felt like they kind of padded it out. So maybe that was effective in that way, but, it felt more to me like they kept moving the goalposts. Where it's like, oh, you have to go do this thing, so, whatever, take your time. And then once you get there, actually with this other thing. And you have all these chains of events where each one points you to the next. And to me, that was less effective, because I was just like, I guess we're going here now. As opposed to, here's my overall thing, right? This is a story about Noctis becoming king, right? And
yep.
Ostensibly it's about what, learning responsibility and duty and, what does it mean to be a good ruler? But and also you need to get all the powers of the king, because you're a special king that's magic, and maybe the king of kings that was prophesized. And I don't know, they don't really point you in that direction. They're just like, oh, well, we should go here now because there's a god that can help us. Okay.
On that note, I do want to mention, just quickly, that I did like how they incorporated the summons into the narrative.
I did too.
Yeah.
But I'll fully agree with you guys on the narrative that we get to that mark, and it's just we're going. I remember even the first time playing that is where I sat down going, oh, this is where we chopped out a good chunk of the game. You could see it right here. This is where it needed another 2-3 years to cook, is right here.
Yep.
And so, yeah, side quests are all you got. It's one big. It's all side quest. There's no main quest.
Yeah, that is a valid point. I do feel like any argument that could be made, like even the justification I'm trying to make, it's weak at best, and more just kind of a means of me providing closure to the pieces that maybe were not fully baked, and that I was just having to kind of accept as this is the game I was given, not necessarily the game that they really truly wanted to make by the end of this. And that unfortunately is just kind of the nature of games. Sometimes you do get ones where there's either the budget and they are just allowed to do whatever, and they hire and hire and hire and do whatever, and then you get something like Red Dead Redemption 2, where it's like the amount of detail is just insane, but then the crunch and everything else that came with it is also insane. Or you get games like this where there's a troubled development cycle, and the fact that the game got released at all was probably the best you could hope for. And like you said, Calamity, like you're kind of just left with it's not really even like a core quest line. It's just all side quests, and you kind of cobble them together, or are forced to cobble them together at the end when you are thrown onto the tracks and told, literal tracks in one of the sequences too, and told you're going to ride this train and see where it leads.
And also your car's on that train, and it was on a boat earlier, but we didn't show it.
Yes, your car is always going on those places too, which further justifies why you're not on the roads anymore. I guess, unless there's more that y'all want to talk about with regards to story or the world, I will just chime in that like one of the coolest sequences for me in the game was seeing a summon like Rama just appear in the midst of a fight and scorch the earth around me. Like that was really, really cool. But I did want to talk a bit about, I know we've touched on it briefly, but about the systems of the game, because I feel there's a lot of criticism that can be levied at these. There's a lot I think that we can say too in terms of things that maybe do work, but from the combat to the elemency to the experience system to even just like equipment, what were people's thoughts on this approach to any of that? Just jump in with any of those that you feel, and I'm sure people will jump on as well.
The elemency is immediately annoying because you have to pause the game to use it. Right? That's one thing that annoyed me. Is so they strategically put a fire and an ice thing next to your camp so that you may gather that resource and then put that into a skill and try and make different skills with these elements, but they only give you a third amount of it at a time, and they don't explain it to you whatsoever. So you go in the pause menu and you just try fill it out all of one, see what it does, try fill half of one, half the other, try see what it does, and then by the time you're far enough in the game, you just stop using it unless it's very obviously telegraphed in front of a boss. And it's like, okay, clearly there's 5 fire things in front of this boss, I must use fire against it. And you have to give up one of your weapons to use the magic. But the magic is limited and the weapon is not. So it seems like everything in the game is discouraging you from using the system, because it's much more of a hassle than just using your weapon. Yeah. And then once you try and use it, it works. As long as the enemy stays in that one area you lit on fire, which it won't. It'll jump around, especially if it's a boss.
Yep.
So that's the downside. But, I mean, hey, it's kind of fun. I wish it worked more like spells, where you could just equip to one of your weapons, and it would just either infuse the weapon with ice, or have it replace a weapon, but it be a beam of ice, so you can actually use it, and not be limited too much. Like, make it limited resource like the weapons magic is, where you can just recharge it when you warp point, but didn't do that. So, I don't know. if they set it up better, I would have used it. What's you guys' opinion?
I feel like it was some of the worst pieces of the junction system from Final Fantasy VIII. It's like, here's a draw point, get this stuff, and then we're going to make it almost impossible or useless for you to use it. Go ahead, Lost Lake.
Well, it was so great that I didn't use it my second playthrough.
And that says everything you need to know.
Right?
Right.
On New Game Plus, you are so overpowered. You have all the weapons, especially since I took the time to go get, like, Ultima weapon the first time I played. Like Ultra was saying, as soon as I have to take my sword off to use this, well, I'm already not doing as much damage as I need to do, and I only have so many uses for this. So, yeah, my second playthrough, I literally just used the Ultima weapon my whole way through.
Oh.
It just smashed things.
And wasn't there friendly fire too with the spells? Like, because weren't there element or like amulets you had to equip to prevent friendly fire?
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Like, every aspect of that made it just way more trouble than it was worth. I would have preferred either a Final Fantasy VIII or Final Fantasy X style integration into the weapons themselves, where it's like, oh, we're gonna go fight a fire monster. I can utilize this blizzard that I've gotten or upgrade it into Blizzara or Blizzaga onto my sword, so that now my sword is ice elemental based. But yeah, Calamity Pocket Edition have anything as annoying as that?
So the combat was a lot simpler in the Pocket Edition. And the elements were basically like you drew them and then you had like one chance to use them. But even in the full edition, from what I've seen from Lost Lake playing, the combat is a lot less tactical than I come to expect from a Final Fantasy game, which is unfortunate. It seems like they kind of traded some of the action for strategy, which is not a trade I would personally make, but that seems to be the direction the series is going in. So, it's okay if it's just not for me. But it's, yeah, I don't know. It was pretty throwaway in Pocket Edition as well. One thing I did like, though, is the moments when you got to play as the other characters, right? You could, like, temporarily take over them. Or if, you had a guest party member, then sometimes they had a special move. And those were pretty fun. But otherwise it was kind of pretty repetitive, right? Once you got your groove down, then you didn't really break from that. And there wasn't a good reason to. Yeah.
I mean, it was like Warp Strike, and then hack and slash to build up the meters, use partners, rinse, wash, repeat. And that was essentially what it was. And then occasionally, if you need to replace your MP and get out of stasis, then get out of there and get out of stasis.
Right. The whole combat system seems to be based around use your companions. Use the rest of the party. Use those moves as much as possible. And then in the meantime, try and do some damage.
Yeah. The other beef I had, too, was, like, the actual king weapons that you get. The fact that they deplete your hit points made them unappealing to me, personally. I'm never big on any kind of weapon in a game where I know there's going to be an HP cost to me, because I know I'm going to be in the thick of it hacking and slashing, and I'm going to basically be doing just as much damage to myself as I am to the enemy. So I very rarely use those, and typically stuck to any of the weapons I had made for me at weapon shops or found that were not the king-specific weapons. Any other thoughts on the combat system? I mean, I feel like we've covered a good chunk of it. And I do agree with you, Calamity. My favorite part was when I could get my teammates in it and doing things. As annoying as hearing Prompto say hello opening was for the umpteenth time, it was still very, very much appreciated that I could do that to take a break from whatever was charging me or attacking me at that time.
It does seem like they made it so that, yeah, you would just, mash the button. When you're tired of mashing the button, use your partner.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. And that's what's a little annoying, because I didn't expect to mash buttons in a Final Fantasy game, of all games.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that is a very important life lesson. I think we could put on a shirt, mash the button, and when you get tired, ask your partner. That right there is a great merch idea. So I guess, unless there's anything else anyone wants to talk about, we can go to like takeaways and just kind of break down our final thoughts on the game club, the game, and then we can be done with it.
There is one more thing I want to talk about that we have not gotten to. So we talked about the main characters, but we didn't talk about any of the peripheral characters, and that's because most of them are throwaway. But I want to argue that Ardyn is one of the all-time great Final Fantasy villains. And that is because he is a theater kid, and he just does stuff to be dramatic and cause trouble, and I love him.
I would say that my two favorite ancillary characters were Ardyn and Iris in the entire game. They were the people who resonated with me the most. The rest I couldn't care less about.
I would add Arania to that list, but yeah, I liked her a lot.
Yeah, Arania she at least had something of an arc, though even again it felt rushed. So, yeah. Lost and Ultra? Any ancillary characters that kind of stood out for y'all?
I agree. Iris and Ardyn are the ones. Ardyn just comes at you in the first city, and he's like, look at me, I'm the villain, and you know it. And you're like, well, yeah, you are. You sure are. And then if you did your homework and watched the movie, you're like, you really, really are. And that's it. Iris is great. Not sure what happens to her. I hope only good things.
And I will say, when Ardyn goes full mask off, like, he starts at, like, okay, you're the villain, but then he really leans into it at one moment with on the train.
Yes.
And I, like, just love that entire sequence, because he's like, well, now you've gone and done something that makes me, now you force my hand and I have to go full super, cartoonish super villain on you. And it's amazing.
Yeah.
I think Ardyn is definitely my favorite villain in a good chunk of the Final Fantasy list. I would give up the DLCs to have more Ardyn time, actually. And I'm sad that his story is in a DLC that is locked behind a paywall, that I end up just watching a YouTube video to understand what is going on.
Yeah. It feels like, again, one of those missed opportunities. Because my favorite method of storytelling right now really is one where, even if they're not necessarily a sympathetic villain, if there is a villain that is captivating, giving me more on just what makes that villain tick is definitely welcome. I don't know what that says about me, but there you have it.
Well, I think it'd be foolhardy to try and explain it, because his plan doesn't make any sense. But it's really entertaining, because he just shows up someplace and he's like, all right, I'm going to cause some chaos, and you're going to have to deal with that, and then I'm going to kind of giggle and then show up at the next place, right? It's like, no part of it is logical, and it's somehow, like, because it's a video game, they try and back justify it later in the story, and even then it's like, I don't think you fully believe this. You're just like, well, he got here, and it, through sheer luck, his grand master plan is happening.
Yep.
But I'm fine with that. Like, truly.
Yeah. I think he has, like, low-level Heath Ledger Joker vibes to him.
For sure.
Just, yeah, wanting to watch the world kind of burn. And at points in time, literally making the world burn.
Yes.
But, yeah.
Maybe just a few cutscenes between Ardyn and Ifrit would have been helpful.
Yes. 100% agree with that.
And he's a much better villain than I think Noctis deserves. But, you know, that's the matchup we get.
Yep.
That's how these things tend to go. When the protagonist leaves some to be desired, usually the villain makes up for it.
Yep. Or one of the party members with the main character. Looking at you, Vaughn, from Final Fantasy XII. Because, as Brett's pointed out in the cast several times, Baltair is definitely the main character of that game, but was unfortunately shelved and brought in as a side character of the party.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm so glad you brought us back to that, Calamity, because, there were at least a couple of supporting cast members who were worth mentioning. I'm still very disappointed in. I always kind of dislike stories where it feels like they're forcing two characters together because they're betrothed or something like that. So like the whole Lunafreya Noctis arranged marriage piece, like I allowed it, but it was not like where I was heavily invested in any part of that. And Lunafreya as a character was horribly underdeveloped. Which sadly I'm finding with Final Fantasy 16 is kind of the way they are handling female characters right now. So that's a little discouraging. But
yeah, I might add, even in the movie, Lunafreya is there, doesn't do much.
Yep.
It's kind of annoying because it's like, okay, I did my homework, I watched the movie, and you did not develop this character that needed developing real bad.
Yep. Nope, not at all.
They do kind of develop her a little bit more in like flashbacks, but I think that she actually is a much better protagonist against Ardyn, because she's like the ultimate order person, right? She's trying to keep everything on track and like has magic to do that. And I don't understand why she didn't. They move her around the world a lot, and I don't understand why she goes the places she does instead of just going straight to Noctis, but at least, she has, like, a sense of purpose, and she, has some conflict within her character that doesn't quite get resolved, but is sometimes interesting to watch. And so that I think, like, facing her against Ardyn would have been a much more compelling hero-villain interaction, because they have similar power sets, maybe, but very different worldviews. So that's like a conversation that can be explored and metaphorized as a battle.
Well, to your point, Calamity, what I really think I want now is I just want Final Fantasy 15 Aranea, honestly, where I can just see her arc the entire game through. I don't care about any of the other characters at that point. I just want to watch her go from basically a sellsword and enlisted with the bad guys to then helping Noctis and the rest of them later in the game.
Yeah, it's so weird how at a certain point of the game, a lot of the Empire people are like, boy, we were fine with genocide, but not destroying the world. It's like, well, okay, I guess welcome to our side, Aranea, whatever your name is pronounced, but yeah. But yeah, as a defector from the Empire, I think there is some interesting, story that you can dive into there.
Yeah, and I think for me that was definitely kind of one of my takeaways from the game was, I think at the end of all of it, the most frustrating thing to me, and at times also the most pleasing thing to me at times, was that I saw potential. Constantly throughout this game I saw potential for what it could have really truly been. And I think that was both, like I said, the most disappointing thing because it wasn't what I actually got. But at the same time, those moments when I felt there was things were clicking, I was like, man, if they had just gone down this path, how awesome would that have been? And that actually truly delighted me. Just thinking, even just imagining what that could have meant delighted me.
Yeah, I think they like did a great job actually at the like world building. It's just the individual character stories often fell flat for me.
Yep, I agree with that. Ultra and Lost, how about y'all?
Yeah, no, that's sounding right around where I am as well. It was a fun romp when I was playing, and I enjoyed my time with it, but I always wanted more, and I could always, again, my imagination would fill in the blanks of, ooh, it'd be cool if they did this, it'd be cool if they did this. That being said, they already threw a lot of yeses at this game, considering how squished things got.
Yeah. I mean, this was talk about a game of just too many yeses.
Right.
And yet, not enough clothing options.
They have
Yeah.
mod support. They have mod support.
There you go. The mods will save us.
I have Wallace and Gromit in my party right now. It's great.
Any other takeaways or anything else that we might have missed while we were talking through this?
I would agree of the too many yeses. A bit like Metal Gear Solid 5 again and again. This is the exact same type of experiment where they said, yes, we will do this. They threw money at this until they didn't have money to throw at it anymore. And then they never got done with it because this was never going to be done. And then they ended up with this product, which is great, super fun, but lacking in some like key ways. And people just want more of it. And they'll keep wanting more even if you add DLCs. So I think it's super interesting in that way. And I'm curious to see if that influenced 16 in any way. So, yeah.
Yeah, for me, I don't know if I'd categorize it as too many yeses, but I think you can definitely see the like forceful shift within Square Enix through the production of this game, right? They moved from sort of the more traditional Final Fantasy, which we still got bits of in 13, 1 through 3, to this more action-oriented, open-world, I would say more like generically AAA design sensibilities. And so you get half of the old stuff and then half of the new stuff. And I don't know if it quite hangs together. So, I mean, especially now with the hindsight of seeing where they went with Final Fantasy 16, I think that you can see the turning point within this game of what systems they were trying out and prototyping and what they were, stuck with from the previous development of Final Fantasy versus 13.
Lost? Any thoughts?
Going back just one step toward, Nolan mentioned the old and the new clashing. They have right in their header that this is for fans, old and new, but I find it's not really approachable for new players whatsoever. I find old players tolerated a lot of it, but I'm not sure how many new players actually got sucked in, especially since you had all that extra story you had to go looking for between the movie and the manga and the anime and whatnot. I feel like if they really wanted this to be for fans old and new, they could have done a little bit better at railroading the new fans in, and maybe playing with systems a little less.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. And now we, especially within Square Enix, right, have like very different projects for fans old and new, right? You have the Final Fantasy VII remakes going on, which are very much targeted at old fans, and then Final Fantasy 16 and that whole direction, which is very much targeted at getting new people into the series with almost no connection to the old games.
one might argue that Final Fantasy VII Remake also took a lot from 15 with the real-time combat, no?
I'd agree with that.
Oh, definitely. You can see a lot of the prototyping for what came out of Remake from 15.
But they did it a good way instead of doing it a bad way.
Learned a lot of lessons, maybe.
Yes, I like that. That's more diplomatic.
Yeah, I think, and actually you can see it with the 15 serves as kind of this branching point where they took the lessons that they learned with regards to how the combat works in 15 and really implemented them in a much better way in 7 Remake. And then they took some of the aspects of this combat system and then really made it more action-oriented for 16. And then chose to streamline aspects of the story. You no longer have a world map that you can navigate. It's more Final Fantasy X-2 in that nature. So this definitely was kind of like a fork in the road, where you can see there were some important lessons learned that are leading in each direction now, I guess.
So as we're wrapping up,
yeah,
would you recommend someone play this?
I will always recommend that Tim Longo Jr. play every Final Fantasy that has ever been made. But that is a really interesting question, Calamity. I think ultimately, if the person has experience with Final Fantasy and some of the previous titles have resonated with them, I would recommend it, but I would do what Belmont did, and I would give them pointers to say, here's what you really need to do to get the most out of this and not bounce off of it and see it through to conclusion. I don't know how you or Lost or Ultra feel.
I would say for sure people should play it. Even not having finished it, I feel like it's very fun. It's worth getting into. It's worth getting past the initial hurdle of the weird combat and then actually giving it a try. One of the times I remember most fondly about this game is when I did one of the event fights where I had to literally use all my items to survive the entire fight because the enemy had a giant health bar. And I feel like that experience was very fun because it showed me the depths of that combat system, even if I wasn't too far into the game. So I would say for sure people should play it. And if for nothing else, then just having some experience with these characters, which I do still very much like.
I think I'd have to ask them why they want to play this one first, get a better idea if this is the right Final Fantasy or not. Because I do agree walking in with pointers is a good idea, the way Belmont had it set up and whatnot. Probably the way to handle it. I'd honestly probably end up trying to steer them away and trying to get them onto one of the other Final Fantasies. But, if they really want to drive around in the car and hang out with the boys, this is the one to really, if you want to get to know your team and hang out with the boys, this is the relaxing one to do that with.
I think I'd recommend people maybe play the Pocket Edition, because I feel like that, in terms of story, was a little bit more streamlined, and if you're just going for that, then you're getting kind of the best that this game has to offer. You're not getting the hunts, which is the one thing that I was missing. But I don't know, in terms of like the open world and the combat and the other systems being so uneven, this kind of cuts out a lot of the stuff that is not as fun. And I don't know, this lets you play through some of the best things in the game. But yeah, I agree with Lost Lake. Play a different Final Fantasy. Play 7. Play 9. 9's a really good jumping on point if you want to get like the old and the new. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's all valid. All right, well, that brings us to, we made it to the hour and 21 minute mark. thank you all for playing along, for providing like really deep insights, not just here on the podcast, but also in the channel. And yeah, I really appreciate all the perspectives you guys brought today. The points you made were incredibly valid, and I just really appreciate your time jumping on. I will go ahead and pass it around so that everybody can say their final remarks and sign-offs. Go ahead and pass it to you first, Calamity.
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me on. Always happy to talk about games. If you want to hear more of me, I am on Twitch at twitch.tv/CalamityNolan, and I make games. You can see them at upatnight.games.
Thanks for that. Lost Lake?
Yeah, I thank you very much for having me. This was a new experience for me. I've chat with you guys in the Discord about video games, but for the most part, I just take it in internally. So it's nice to be producing something. I started twitching as well, Lost Lake 86 over on that platform, and I'm going to stick to our book club games for the most part, as long as I've got a copy laying around of whatever we're doing, and I'm 3 for 3 so far, so I'm feeling pretty good. What about you, Ultrasun?
Oh, well, as for me, I do not stream on Twitch, but I'll be around on the Discord, and it was very fun, to do this. For sure, I do my best attempts at every game club and usually don't finish the games, so that's what I'm up to.
Awesome, and I'm Oh Hi Mark. I don't stream on Twitch. I'm more behind-the-scenes kind of guy. But you will find me popping into the Discord from time to time. I do have social media accounts, but I don't use them a whole lot. So the Discord is kind of where you'll find me. Unless you're on GitHub, then you'll find me there too, building out the JuneBot for the Discord. But yeah, so thank you all for joining. Thank you, whoever has chosen to listen. And I guess we'll see each other and everyone else in the Discord. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.